In the first verse of Ephesians, the author identifies himself as Paul, the apostle of Christ Jesus. But a lot of Christians don't realize that a lot of scholarship, probably the majority, has challenged the view that Paul was a true author. So in this video, I'm going to share my thoughts on the ongoing debate among scholars. Did Paul write the book of Ephesians, or was it written by an unknown author attempting to mimic Paul and his authority as an apostle? Heads up, this video is a bit more technical than normal, but I'd like to try this out and see how it flies. Stick around till the end though, because my biggest point, the last one, is probably the easiest to grasp, and it applies to a bunch of other books of the Bible whose authorship is challenged. So here we go. As far as I'm aware, the early church unanimously agreed that Paul wrote the letter to the Ephesians, without exception. In fact, probably the first serious challenge to the authorship of Ephesians was not until the late 18th century. This argument, though it doesn't take much time to share, carries tremendous weight. As I've explained in a previous video, those living in the first few hundred years of the church would have had many more connections with other people and many more resources on hand to help them determine the authorship of the New Testament books. Plus, it's not like they were unaware of the fact that certain writings were circulating around with falsely attributed authors. These writings were condemned by the early church and not included in the canon of the New Testament, as evidenced by Peter O'Brien in his commentary on Ephesians during the introduction. Another argument for affirming Paul's authorship is that it includes personal information that you would not expect to see from someone pretending to write as Paul. Granted, a clever writer might include personal information if they were really trying to deceive, but that's not typically the argument of those who challenge Paul's authorship. Instead, they say that writing in the name of someone else was just common practice as a way to carry on a person's tradition. That being the case, why would this common practice include personal references? Why would someone other than Paul himself say in Ephesians 6:19, "Pray for me"? Why would this person conclude his letter with some housekeeping notes, giving the Ephesians a heads up about his plan to send Tychicus to them, saying, "He will tell you everything so that you also may know how I am and what I am doing"? This doesn't sound like a pretend Paul who's carrying on a harmless tradition by writing in someone else's name, or even someone intentionally trying to deceive. This sounds like actual Paul, who is relating to the Ephesians in a way that only Paul uniquely could. Even still, there are some serious reasons why many scholars deny the authorship of Paul. One of those reasons is that it's not personal enough. The other letters, which are very confidently from Paul, tend to share even more personal notes and instructions than Ephesians does. It's a fair point, but as I'll share a little later, we must be careful not to read too much into such differences. Another reason for denying that Paul wrote Ephesians is because the author appears to have copied from Colossians. This would make sense for someone trying to mimic Paul, right? Use his other source. But many argue that it would be odd for actual Paul to take some of his own phrases from Colossians and repurpose them for the Ephesians. This argument is actually much more complex to share in full, but at the end of the day, I find that there are just too many uncertainties to put much weight on this argument. The authorship of Colossians is also challenged by some, which complicates the conversation. It's also not entirely clear if Colossians draws from Ephesians or if it's the other way around. Some have pointed out that the theological agendas of Ephesians and Colossians are too divergent to reflect much dependence. Plus, how strange is it really that Paul would recycle some of his earlier phrases and statements for a different purpose? Could he not have the same thoughts still running through his head? However we think about this, we must admit that it's not a hard science. Another reason for denying Pauline authorship of Ephesians is because Ephesians is notably different in theology. Now, we're not saying that the theology of Ephesians flatly contradicts the theology taught in Romans or Galatians, but the emphasis is much different. Ephesians focuses much more on the resurrection and exaltation of Christ rather than his death. In fact, you may have noticed that the gospel summary in Ephesians 2:1-8 doesn't even mention the death of Christ. Likewise, you don't hear Ephesians say much about works of the law, which was a common subject of Paul. You'll often hear people say, rightly, that Ephesians puts a striking emphasis on so-called realized eschatology, which is unlike other writings of Paul. In other words, Ephesians focuses on the unseen heavenly realities, such as saying we are raised with Christ and seated with him in the heavenly realms. That is curious language, which you don't see so much in other writings of Paul. Likewise, Paul tends to use the word church for a local assembly, whereas Ephesians tends to speak of the church as a global thing encompassing all believers. All of this might even sound more like later Gnosticism than something Paul would say. Despite the many unique theological features of Ephesians, it's long been argued that the reason for these differences may simply be because the Ephesian people were in a unique setting with unique issues which Paul was seeking to address. This theory found pretty solid grounding after the work of Dr. Clint Arnold, whose dissertation looked at the Ephesian people in the mid-first century. He argued that the converts to Christianity in that area had a background in magical practices like shamanism, and so Paul needed to address all this power stuff by speaking on heavenly realities in a language that they could relate to. Long story short, I think these theological differences in Ephesians are not because it was a different author. It's because it was a different audience. Lastly, and somewhat related, one big reason people deny Pauline authorship of Ephesians is because it just doesn't sound like Paul to them. The vocabulary and style are notably different. Most significantly, the language of Ephesians often sounds like the language employed by the early church fathers after the time of Paul, which leads people to think that Ephesians was written after the time of Paul. However, since these fathers were reading from Ephesians, and since Ephesians was such a treasured piece of writing to them, it could be that their writing was influenced by Ephesians rather than the other way around. Regardless, it still sounds different than Paul. This line of argumentation is used all the time when the traditional author of a biblical book is challenged. Many have said that the differences here in Ephesians are overstated, but for the sake of argument, let's concede that they are substantial. In response, you'll hear conservative scholars say, look, these people sometimes write differently depending on their mood or circumstances or whatever. But for those who reject the authorship, they'll say, I understand, but the differences are too many. It's too fanciful. It's asking too much. For me, I look at this and I think, is it though? Is it really a hard sell to say that someone like Paul might be able to express himself differently than what he is typically known for? Dude, like my style changes like every year. Just look at my earlier videos. I promise you, I did those ones too. Here's the problem. Think back to when you watch those historical drama productions, like The Chosen or whatever, where they portray some historical figure, okay? And you see on screen that this person has a personality who laughs and cries and struggles, etc. And we look at this and think, wow, I'm seeing him so differently. It's like we're surprised to find out that this historical person is human. I don't know why it is, but it seems like we have a tendency to imagine every person who lived before our time was one-dimensional. But with just a little reflection, it becomes so obvious that human behavior is hardly that predictable. Think about how different you are when around friends compared to being around family, compared to being at work or around strangers. Think about how your conversation changes, your style changes, even your personality traits, which are emphasized or suppressed. Think about how different you've changed over the past 3 years. Think of the language you've adopted or set aside as you learn, mature, or undergo transitions in life. I know this expression is absurdly overused, but we have to stop putting biblical authors in a box. Humanity is complex, and there are so many factors that dramatically change how we operate. Maybe the problem is not that they sound so strangely different than their usual habits. What if the real problem is that we don't see historical people as dynamic, flexible, multifaceted, living human beings? I recognize that we do have characteristics which tend to stay with us regardless of time or circumstance. So there is some value in discussing our idiosyncrasies, but I suspect the big problem these days is that we tend to overthink the differences. Human beings have always been unique, creative, engineering. We see this in ourselves, and if we can imagine the same for those who lived centuries before us, it really shouldn't be hard to accept what tradition has been telling us all along, that Paul wrote the book of Ephesians. So, Thanks for enduring. That was a heavy one, but you made it through. This is an ongoing debate among scholarship, and it's not going to end anytime soon, but I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.